Hi, it's Mark Cooper Smith, UC Berkeley, and I am really excited today to spend some time in our series of conversations with Sean Ellis. Sean, first of all, hi, Sean.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Sean is famous in particular for the term growth hacking. Sean coined the term growth hacking, has written a book, which I will shamelessly promote with you, called Hacking Growth, which is a fantastic book. So we're going to go through this conversation, and it's a fantastic resource. And we're going to talk about a few resources during this conversation around how you can get better as a growth hacker, as a marketer, and was one of the first marketing, actually, I think you were the first marketing executive at Dropbox. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about growth hacking, what it is, how to do it, and some key takeaways. So Sean, let me just start right in with you, and that is, what is growth hacking?
So yeah, that's the big question. So growth hacking is really about experimentation, and through experimentation, learning how to accelerate your ability to acquire and retain customers and keep them engaged on a product. And so some people might say that sounds a lot like marketing and the way marketing should be. But I think one of the differences is that at least in the digital world, marketers tend to be more around customer acquisition and maybe conversion, but really top of funnel, where growth hacking is about looking at all of the levers of growth. So how do we acquire? How do we convert? How do we turn customers from people who've experienced the product once to building a habit around that and really driving engagement? How do we drive referral from existing customers, even monetization? It's really, ultimately sustainable growth is about getting all parts of that customer creation engine humming, and it's really hard to know what's going to work and what's not going to work until you experiment. So I think there's a mantra at Netflix for many years that was nobody knows anything, and I think that's a good kind of mentality to have when you go into it, that you learn by testing and doing, and customers are fickle. It's hard to know what they're going to respond to. And so it's all about test, measure, learn, understand, and keep building on that understanding as you run more experimentation.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. So there's a lot there. So let's break some of those elements down. When we talk about growth hacking, we're talking about, from the organization standpoint, how can we acquire and grow our customer base, right?
That's
now,
correct.
most of the time, at least when many people think about growth hacking, they think, oh, it's about acquiring customers. But it goes a lot beyond that. You mentioned many other elements. Is it frequency of purchase? Does it deal with retention? You mentioned Netflix. I mean, once you acquire a customer, what's the most important metric there? It's probably retaining them as a customer.
Right.
How does growth hacking help there? So if you can kind of differentiate a little bit between the acquisition element of growth hacking as a marketing tool versus the revenue growth side once you have a customer.
Yeah, and in fact, I would even take it one other piece. Like, revenue, of course, is what keeps us in business. That's what it's all about. But I think a lot of times what you find is companies can be growing revenue at a really steep growth trajectory, but value delivered to customers is not growing at that same trajectory. And so what happens over time is revenue eventually crashes because there's not value moving in the same direction. So in the growth hacking world, we talk about a North Star metric as a metric that reflects how customers get value from the product. And so acquisition is just one of those levers, again, that grows that North Star metric. And so if you acquire, let's use that Netflix example. If you acquire someone who signs up for Netflix and they watch one show a month, then they're getting value. Actually, revenue looks pretty good there. But if they're watching one show a month, there's a good chance they're going to cancel the service because they're not getting their money's worth on it. And so what Netflix is doing is trying to maximize watching hours, for example. So that's the metric that they're optimizing on. And they know if they grow watching hours by 100% year after year, and revenue is growing by 100%, that revenue is likely to be sustained. That revenue growth is likely to be sustained over time. And so I think that's one of the real principles of growth is figuring out a metric that really reflects value delivered to customers. And so the North Star metric is how we tend to communicate that. So for a company like Uber, it would be weekly rides. So just because you've got someone to download the app doesn't mean that they're going to generate much revenue for you, but every time they take a ride, they're getting value, they're building that habit, and they're likely to become a long-term retained, engaged customer if they're using it frequently. And then so it is revenue in the end, but what's that proxy metric that ensures that revenue is sustainable and frankly is a lot more I think motivating for the team. It's really hard long-term for a team to get excited about just growing revenue. But if there's a mission to the business and they're excited about progress against that mission, and that mission is about impact on customers, and you can express that in a metric, then growing that metric is something that suddenly you have everyone in the organization pulling in the same direction. So maybe a growth team, but that growth team is going to have to work closely with a product team, an engineering team. And the more that they're all pulling in the same direction for a big picture metric, you're going to have a lot more alignment and effectiveness.
Yeah. So what's interesting about what you just said is if we look at the Netflix example, Netflix is actually more profitable if people pay their subscriptions every month and they don't watch as much content, right? Mm-hmm. If Netflix is serving up a lot of content, like they are right now in particular, as we're all staying at home, then they have additional costs. But the key metric that you're talking about isn't necessarily absolute profitability per customer per month. It's a different metric. Now, one of the challenges I'm going to zig and then we'll zag right back. One of the challenges we sometimes have is that we use the wrong metrics to do things, like we sometimes measure the wrong metrics. And when you talk about growth hacking, in this instance, you're ultimately trying to figure out how do you both attract but then keep your customer as satisfied as possible? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
As happy as possible?
Yeah. So that Netflix example that you just mentioned, yes, short-term profitability, the ideal is that, they pay you money and you don't have any costs associated with them.
Right.
But if they're not getting value, any subscription business is really based on churn. And if you can keep churn to a really low level and you can retain customers long term, that's key to long term profitability in the business. So it's better to maybe leave a little bit more money on the table in the short term, but ensure that the customer is getting a lot of value, then they're going to keep paying you over time.
Yeah, I want to kind of step back and think about the customer life cycle a little bit. And many of us have different ways that we think about what that funnel looks like as far as the attraction of the funnel or the total customer life cycle. Let me share a little bit of mine, and then I'd like to get a sense as to how you apply growth hacking at each of these different stages. So for me, there are kind of three key buckets. There's the pre-sale, there's the purchase, and then there's the post-sale and the retention piece of it. And for me, it kind of goes a little bit like this. If I look at it, the first stage would be awareness of the product to begin with. The second would be an interest in getting more knowledge around the product, becoming knowledgeable. And then the third might be, I'm going to consider this product. But then is the key thing. How do you flip them over to actually try or buy the product? So that's a key element. What's the motivation for them to buy? And then after that, how do you keep them satisfied and loyal? And of course, the ultimate objective as a marketer and probably as a growth hacker is to turn them into an advocate, to help them bring more, to have them become marketers for the product when you don't have to necessarily pay them for that, or you pay them very little. So as we think about that, awareness, knowledge, consideration, purchase, and then post, satisfaction, loyalty, and advocacy. How does growth hacking kind of work across that spectrum of looking at it from the customer's point of view?
So yeah, it's interesting because most of my experience has been in fairly early stage companies.
Right.
And so,
and that's where, and sorry to cut, but
yeah,
this is where so many early stage companies, it's kind of a growth at all costs. So we'll come back there, right?
yeah.
Because you have to show you're moving the needle. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
So, yeah. So the challenge in an early stage company, I used to get all the time that early stage CEOs would say, "Hey, can you come in and help us build some awareness for this business?" And what I essentially, my approach to that has kind of been, the average person sees several thousand advertisements per day. And on a startup budget, the chances that you're going to make any kind of impact to build any kind of awareness is really low. The chances that you can pull that off on the amount of money that you have as a startup. And so for me, what I really optimize on is experiences. And so it's really without, in a given day or month or, week, you might have, one or two new product experiences a month, or, maybe you have a new one every day, but compared to the thousands of advertisements you're seeing, it's just such a smaller number. So optimizing on how do I get people to an experience is kind of where I start from. And so of course you have to have some level of awareness to get them there. So it's a little bit of just sort of the semantics on awareness, but for me, it's about really desire and friction are your two big levers there. And so it just, as you said, motivation. If you have enough desire and motivation, people will walk through fire for whatever you're offering. So they'll go through a lot of friction. But why would you have a lot of friction if you could avoid that? So your two big levers are increase that desire and reduce that friction. And that's going to get more people to that first experience. And to me, then a key concept in growth becomes speed to value. So how quickly can I get someone to a valuable experience that they're going to want to come back and use that? And the longer that delay is, the more people you're going to lose along the way.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, as you were discussing that arc, I was thinking digital products versus physical products.
Mm-hmm.
And I was expecting there to be an element where, no, this really applies to digital products. But I don't think that you differentiate between that. You can growth hack on physical products as well, at least the way that you were framing it.
Yeah, it's easier in the digital world.
Right.
But I actually just went through a series of interviews on my podcast with high growth physical products. So, companies like Mirror that recently got acquired by Lululemon. I interviewed their CEO, and I went through a number of these interviews to sort of see how do you reconcile that speed to value? From the time I looked at that product to the time, so I actually ended up ordering one for my family, and by the time that it, we took it out of the box, it was weeks later. And so speed to value was pretty slow there. And so I think a lot of times, like in the physical product world, you're going to try to simulate that value as much as you can through video and through kind of more of an immersive experience that gets you excited enough to not cancel in the delivery window. So again, it's still about, the real experience is not until you actually use the product, but it's you want to kind of give them as big of a taste of that experience as possible, so that they'll stick around and actually won't cancel pre-delivery.
So speed to value certainly works well in the digital arena, because I can push buy and the product can show up almost instantaneously.
Right.
But as we look across the kind of, let's come back to that consumer life cycle. What is it typically, as we talk about kind of those areas what is it typically that prompts someone to push that buy button?
Well, so, a couple of things. Like one, it's not always a buy button. So, so I think
it could be a try button. It could be a number of other things too, right?
Well, like let's take kind of the extreme example of a consumer digital product that has a really long path to value. And there's not really a buy, and maybe it's like a sign up, but it would be Facebook. Mm-hmm. And so when does someone actually experience Facebook? It's not when they sign up and fill out a profile, they haven't experienced it. All they've done is create a profile. And if they don't connect with anyone, they're ultimately not going to get any value from Facebook.
Right.
And if they make one connection, they might get some taste of value because they're actually going to be able to, maybe someone they haven't seen since high school, and they see, oh, they have a family now and the rest of it, but they come back the next day and probably nothing's changed on that profile. So they got a little taste of value. So what Facebook recognized is that it's not until you have about, I think it's 10 friends. I always get mixed up.
Was it 10 friends in 7 days?
That's right. Is it 7 friends in 10 days or 10 friends in 7 days?
Exactly, right.
Yeah, but recognizing that it's at a certain number of friends that you now are likely, when you go back in to Facebook, that you're likely in your feed to get fresh content that's people you know that you want to start coming back on a regular basis. And if it takes a month to get to that point, most people are going to give up. And so for them, it's all about, how can we get them as quickly as possible to that experience to where they stay long-term retained. And so that experience is based on the number of friends that are connected. So that's well beyond kind of a buy button.
Right. But I guess that's a sign up button. But that's, I love that example to kind of, to pull back just a bit. It's exactly what Sean was saying, and that is Facebook recognized that to get a good user, they needed to build some velocity in the kind of friend and conversations. So they put in place that rule. I'm with you. I don't know if it was 10 friends in 7 days or 7 friends in 10 days, but they worked really hard. And is this part of what would fall underneath growth hacking? They worked really hard to help every new user hit those metrics.
Yep. And it's not just that they worked hard, but it's also, that was the primary focus. So you could say, oh, well, we lose 82% of people in that window, so we better show them a lot of advertisements before they disappear. So at least we recover our acquisition costs. Or you could say, let's not show any of them advertisements and instead fill that inventory with people you might know, and just keep showing them people who are connected to the people. They've got now 2 people who are the common connections there, and optimize everything to get them to the minimum people that they're likely to stick around. And so I think that's the big benefit, that when you say that's the one thing that matters right now, you can kind of focus everything around that experience to get them there. And now once you have them long-term retained, they're going to see hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of ads over the course of their lifetime with Facebook versus the 7 ads that you might have been able to show before they disappeared. So I think it's that focus. So another example, just to kind of think in that kind of path to value, would be Uber. And, in this case, it's a marketplace. So you've got drivers and you've got riders. But if you look at it from the rider perspective, and I take my first experience with it, in the early days when it was still called Uber Cab, one of my investors in my company had been an early investor in Uber. And so Uber had essentially provided the transportation for a couple of days of like the portfolio companies getting together for sort of a VC camp or something. And I didn't really, it's just like, oh, okay, this is just a black car that's driving us around. It didn't really like resonate as being that valuable. But then a couple of days later, when it was time to go home, I'm staying in my hotel in San Francisco and waiting for a cab to come by, and I got to get to the airport on time. And I'm waiting and I'm thinking, oh crap, I'm going to end up missing my flight. Wait, what was that Uber thing? And so I downloaded the app. I quickly plugged in my credit card, pushed a button. 5 minutes later, a car pulled up. I'm on my way to the airport. Like, I'm hooked, suddenly transportation on demand. Like so I got to my aha moment to where now it's about Uber saying, are they going to be that thing only when I can't find a cab and I'm running late? Or do I build a habit around every time I'm going out to a bar, I take an Uber. Every time, now instead of rental cars, I'm taking Ubers around, and the math works out better. Or instead of the taxis, I'm taking Ubers. And so I think it's that speed to value, and obviously for a driver, it's going to be different. You download the app. My daughter actually started to drive for Postmates a couple of weeks ago, and the first time money hit her app, she'd never had a paying job before. The first time money hit her app, she was hooked. And, 2 weeks later, she's in, over $1,000 earned. She's super excited to keep earning that money. And so she's hooked on it kind of from the other side. But that's that kind of, what's the point where they have enough value from the experience that they're likely to keep using it? And then the next step is, how do you build that habit to have them keep using it?
Well, and as we think back to when we all started using Uber or Lyft or others for the very first time, there were a number of incentives that these rideshare companies would dangle in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
Here's $5 off your next 3 rides or whatever. So I'm going, or $10 off or whatever. So you go, it's almost free. Let me use it again. And if you have 2 or 3 good experiences beyond just that one of rushing to the airport, then you start to change the way you define that, and it becomes an everyday part of your life, which is, of course, what they've become.
Yep. Absolutely. So maybe not so much lately.
Yeah, maybe not so much lately, right? But still, one of the ways then is, even once you have a customer, it's how do we drive usage? How do we change the way they perceive us?
Yeah.
So let's shift to one of your roles explicitly, kind of early in the days of growth hacking, when you were the very first marketer for Dropbox. And Dropbox is one of those seminal examples that we use for growth hacking. What was your insight, and what did you do at Dropbox?
So I joined the week that Dropbox publicly launched at a TechCrunch event. Now, I think it was called TechCrunch 50 back then, and now whatever they call it, but TechCrunch Disrupt, I think is
the Disrupt, exactly.
Yeah. But so they launched that week. They'd had a good private beta up to that point. So I think, 100,000 plus people signed up and were using during that private beta. So I could see some good kind of usage patterns in there. So the first thing that I did was, I thought, don't screw this up. There's something good here. Don't screw this up. So understand how this thing is growing right now. What's working? What does that look like? And so I think I ran, for the first 30 days that I was there, ran at least a survey every single day. So I basically said, okay, give me, what are the total users? Let's divide those up into lots of little tiny groups. And I'm going to survey each one of those groups and figure out exactly some of the things you talked about, like motivations, what was the first thing they did. I'm going to also study the data. So we implemented, additions. They had pretty good tracking, but added some additions to the tracking system, so I could reconcile, what are they saying? What are they doing? And, one of the questions that I have surveyed for years, has become more popular in the last couple of years. A lot of people have started using this, is a question of just asking early users on the product, how would you feel if you could no longer use this product? And finding which people say, I would be very disappointed. So I gave them the choice: very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, not disappointed. And so when I find those users who say they would be very disappointed with the product, then I want to learn everything I can about those users. So studying the data of what was the first thing they did, how did they discover it? And then also studying who are all the people who tried to sign up for Dropbox and stopped using after a day, or never actually used, and come up with as many ideas as I can around why that's happening. And then also survey, if they sign up and they don't install, then I have an email address where I can send out and ask them, hey, saw you tried to sign up and looks like you weren't able to use it. Can you help me understand what's going on?
Right.
And so between, customer interviews and surveys and data, just try to get the best picture that I could of how is this thing growing, and then thought, okay, what are some things that we can do to improve this engine? So one of the first things that I realized is that word of mouth was really strong on the product. And so and then some of the economics are sort of tight with the product, where ultimately, when you have a freemium model like Dropbox does, is essentially what you're doing is, let's say I'm converting, it's not this high, but like 10% of the users to pay for it, and those 10% of users generate $400 per month. out of 100 users, the 10% generate 400. That $400 needs to offset the storage cost of all 100 people who use it. So the extra storage cost for the premium users and all of the free, and if it doesn't, then you don't have, the margins to even sustainably try to grow the business.
Let me break in. I presume everybody that's watching this knows the freemium business model, but just in case, you give a basic version of your product away for free. And then when people want more, in the case of Dropbox, it would be more storage. All of a sudden they have to pay for it. And it's having those people that are paying for it subsidize everybody that gets to use it, right?
Yep.
So I often ask this question too, when I'm in a room. I said, okay, who uses Dropbox? Almost everybody raises their hand.
Yep.
Then I ask, how many of you pay for it? And it depends, but typically about 10% of the people raise their hand. So then I say, great, you're paying for all the other 90% of the freeloaders that are in here. But it's a phenomenally profitable business model, right? Because storage is just not that expensive.
Yeah. And so what happens is that it's such an amazing value proposition on the free product that people can't help but talk about it. And so they get really excited and spread the word. And so that ultimately, instead of having a lot of margin to pay to acquire customers, what you're hopefully doing is, through the word of mouth on your free product, you have a steep enough growth trajectory that monetizing a portion of that steep growth trajectory of the free users makes the business work. And so pretty early on,
you did something else though with Dropbox, right? As opposed to just hoping people would talk about it and share with their friends, there was something really particular you did. One of those levers you talk about. What was that?
Yeah. Well, so that's kind of the second piece of this. The first is, can we actually pay to acquire customers on this? And I looked and saw that that the margin left over, our profit margin left over after the acquisition and paying for everyone's storage, meant that we really couldn't compete very well in paid channels. But if we could, that'd be great. Like, we could plow money
paid
in.
Channels being return. Things like advertising.
Yeah, advertising, like Google ads, Facebook ads, just finding a way to arbitrage. Spend $1, get $2 back.
Right.
You should do that all day long. So. But I did see all of this user passion. So pretty early on, within the first week or two of just studying the feedback from users and just seeing all of this user passion, and people were finding out through word of mouth, I said to the founders, Drew and Arash, I said, we should be doing everything we can to leverage the user base to grow the user base. That I think we can really build a user-driven growth engine. And so that's when we then came up with this idea of an incentivized referral program to further accelerate the word of mouth that was already really strong on there. And so what we offered was, if you told someone else about the product, we would give you additional free space on the product. And so there were some people that, first of all, they were really passionate about the product anyway, so they didn't mind referring it. But like, I knew people who had businesses where they just wanted to get their whole business on it and save themselves a lot of money. So they would literally be telling everyone they could about the product to get all these credits to be able to have a lot of storage space to be able to use.
Well, and then you talk a lot about eliminating friction, and you made it really easy for people to share it with their friends, right?
Right.
You made it really easy for people to import their contacts. You made it really easy so they could blast it out to 500 friends and get all of these gigabytes of free storage if those friends did the uptake. So
absolutely. And in fact, that work preceded this referral program. That, once I had gone through studying everything about how people were using the product and all of the data, then I figured out what are some things that we could potentially do to reduce friction and really improve the growth on the product. So reducing friction is a lot easier than building momentum in the product. So I basically scripted the first 10 experiments, and even going back a little bit further, in my contract with Drew when I joined the company, one of the key objectives was to create a culture of growth and experimentation. And I knew if you go one experiment at a time and you string together enough failures, people are going to give up on the process. So what I wanted to do was get a commitment from the team that we're going to run all 10 of these experiments before we make a judgment on experimentation. And I was super considered on what experiments we should be running based on all of the insights I'd uncovered through studying the user base. And so pretty quickly, the team could see massive increases in, every time we could double a conversion rate in one place or another. There were lots of different paths into that product. You could just see that growth trajectory going up. And so, so the velocity of experimentation remains strong to this day and was able to get built pretty quickly. And so not surprising, by the time we launched the referral program, it was the idea that we're going to want to run a lot of experiments to optimize that program was pretty clear.
So I want to come back to this issue of growth hacking versus what people might think of traditional marketing. And what you just said is one of those elements, which is we're going to run a ton of experiments, but it's good marketers run experiments too all the time. What is it that's different? If you can find, what are 2 or 3 kind of unique elements where we say, well, growth hacking is good marketing, and here's what we do in addition to that, or how we think about it, whether it's the traditional 4 Ps of product, price, place, promotion, product, price, place, promotion, and that's it, right? I got them. Exactly. Oh, that was all 4. I have 5 fingers. I'm going, there's one left, but there's only 4 Ps, right? So whether we look at that or whether we look at some of the different levers that you're pulling, kind of help us understand what that distinction is. What's kind of unique about this?
Yeah. So again, I'm approaching this very much from sort of early stage tech companies, and in Silicon Valley in particular, most of the time, it's a very engineering driven culture, product driven culture. And, for years, marketers have sort of been this like, oh man, if we could just make the product good enough, we could even get rid of these guys. So it's almost like a fairly like cultural divide between, say, marketing and product. And so the idea that marketers could work one of those 4 Ps, product, is just, in theory, the 4 Ps.
Don't get near my product, right?
Yeah, in theory, 4 Ps is what a marketer should be doing. In practice, in tech anyway, most marketers were focused on, positioning, brand identity, and then maybe customer acquisition. Not even all of them.
Advertising would be in there, right?
Yeah,
exactly. But don't get, because the product was more, it was product managers and engineers that would control that, right?
Exactly. And what I would say is that, 10 years ago when I came up with the term growth hacking, it had probably even already moved to the point where most digital marketers were also working the landing pages. But I can tell you that when I first started at LogMeIn, that would have been 15, 16 years ago. I had a lot of pushback in the idea that I could control any content on the website. And so we had to really negotiate a whole separate subdomain for our landing pages where I could have an engineer on my marketing team, a designer, and not engineer, but, kind of a web person who could experiment with copy on landing pages and layout and that sort of thing. So even that was sort of a gradual push more deeply. But the truth is, the place between the landing page that tries to get someone to sign up and building a habit within the product, that was kind of wide open. Most product teams are thinking, what is the product roadmap? If I'm really good at product, I'm going to talk to my customers, understand their needs, double down on their needs, build even more stuff. But that path of getting a new customer to that great first time experience in the product, really nobody was focused on that. And so I think that's one of the things that, in theory, marketing maybe should have been, product maybe should have been, product and marketing maybe should have been the same thing even, or, part of the same group. But in reality, there was definitely this siloed situation. So I think that's where, for me in particular, I really helped to bridge that at LogMeIn, to be able to, we once we decided, okay, if we focus on no man's land there and try to drive improvement on the sign up to usage rate, we're going to be able to grow this business. Without that, we're going to really suffer. And so when I first started trying to grow LogMeIn, which was kind of the long-term thing that I did right before Dropbox, we hit a wall where 95% of the people who signed up for LogMeIn never once used the product.
That's bad.
That's really bad.
Yeah.
But it was a super, you have to, sign up, download software, install that software, configure a firewall to make sure that that software is not being blocked, go to a different computer, log in through that other computer, know your credentials for logging in, you know, like if it's Windows, know your Windows login stuff to get into your own computer. And so not surprisingly, most people gave up by the time they could have gone through that path. And so to address that, just real quick on this, to address that, I presented the data to my CEO that said, we're going to have a really hard time spending money to grow this business. And I was hoping maybe one product person would work with us. He actually said, you know what, we're going to have all the product team focus on this first-time user experience. I also want all the marketing team to focus on this first-time user experience for the foreseeable futures. Don't try to develop any new channels in marketing. We're not doing anything on the roadmap in product. Both teams are going to come together and focus on this gap. And in about 3 or 4 months of a ton of experimentation and user research and these other pieces, we were able to increase the sign up to usage rate to 50%, which huge. Is a 10x improvement.
That's a 10x, yeah.
So every dollar that I was spending on a marketing test before and only getting 50 cents back, now that same dollar is getting $5 back. So no new creativity on the marketing side. I went and retested everything I'd previously tested. I could scale now from $10,000 a month to $1 million a month in paid marketing with a 3-month payback on marketing dollars invested. And that only accounted for 20% of our new users. The other 80% were coming through word of mouth. People who tried the product, they actually loved the product. When you find out through word of mouth, you're going to overcome those barriers more. If Joe could figure this out, I should be able to. And so it basically, the whole business took off. And so for me, that's a lot of the aha that led to growth hacking was when you start to integrate product with marketing and get all the parts of the growth engine working together, that's just way more effective.
Perfect. All right, I have 2 questions and then maybe a bonus question as we kind of move towards wrapping up our conversation here.
Sure.
The first, coming from the perspective of having authored, my book, the Other F Word, How You Put Failure to Work, is what are some examples? You just gave a great example with Log Me In of a failure that you figured out, but what are some examples that you see in the current marketplace? And we don't have to necessarily name the guilty, but there might be some specifics where people have some of the things right, but they're just getting 1 or 2 things fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common example, particularly in the startup world, is essentially never actually having a product that has enough value to be able to sustainably grow that product. So it's not just a matter of, if I can just get enough people to the right experience. If that right experience doesn't exist, then it doesn't matter. All the things that I've talked about with growth hacking don't matter. So it really does start with product and that path to product market fit. So a lot of people will try to skip over that and grow the business without getting to product market fit. And I've been in situations where I've tried to grow when there wasn't product market fit.
Right. And
I'm terrible at growth in that situation. And so I think a lot of times, I definitely 5 of the first 6 businesses that I worked on that were early stage reached that $1 billion valuation mark. And I point to luck as a huge part of that. It means that 5 of those first 6 products had enough value in the product that the teams I was working with could focus on getting people to an experience that would get to $1 billion valuation type business. And so, product market fit, not being able to get there is probably the biggest mistake. Focusing on the wrong thing. So focusing on trying to grow when you don't have that and diluting those efforts is another big mistake. But there's a ton of them.
There's a ton. So when we take a look at this process within the startup growth curve, starting early with that customer discovery, understanding your customers, solving their problem, not offering a solution, right? So coming up with that, because it's through that you gain an understanding of undermet needs and good customers, and you get that product market fit. You can't market yourself out of a hole where you don't have product market fit. Is that right?
Right. Well, so I'll give you one kind of interesting insight though, is that you kind of potentially can. It depends on what the challenge on product market fit. So I mentioned, I asked that question, how would you feel if you could no longer use this product?
Right. I love that question.
Yeah, what I'm trying to find there is enough people who say I'd be very disappointed that it gives me that signal that I can probably grow this. Now, if they say they'd be very disappointed and they stop using the product, then I would focus on the actual data more than the survey results. But the problem is that it can take a really long time to see the results on the data side. So on the survey side, it's this good leading indicator. I had one company that I went in and I was committed to a 6-month go-to-market project with them. And I asked that question and only 7% of the users said that they would be very disappointed without the product. And it was kind of like, oh crap, I've committed 6 months to this product and only 7% are saying they'd be very disappointed. We got it to 40% in 2 weeks off the next cohort of users. And so we didn't do that by changing the product in 2 weeks. You can imagine that, like, product iterations can take, you know, months or years to ultimately hone in on product market fit. So what we did was we found in those 7% of users, a lot of them were focused on the same benefit. So people who focus on this benefit said that they would be very disappointed without the product. That means that the product's pretty good at delivering on that benefit. And so if we can reposition on that benefit, build a strong promise around there, and then streamline the onboarding to deliver the experience of that benefit. And so for these guys, they had a fairly fragmented experience across, you know, multiple sort of apps within an app. And so we basically just, you know, shined a spotlight on the one that really seemed to be sticking and tuned out the other ones and then surveyed the next group of people. They were at 40%. 6 months later, it was at 60%.
Yeah, but you actually had a different pool of customers at that point, right?
Exactly. We sort of each new cohort that signed up, we kept iterating on this, but I see it all the time that, you know, early in a business, you'll mention the 45 benefits that this product might potentially deliver.
You got to figure out the 3 that matter. Yeah.
Yeah. And it may be that you picked the wrong 3.
Right.
So in the beginning, being fairly broad is good, but what you want to be able to do is tighten into what really matters. And consumers are fickle. It's really hard to know what's going to resonate with them or not. And so that's why you need to kind of focus on the feedback till you see, okay, you've kind of crowdsourced, we nailed it in something, and now let's adjust the business around that something.
So the other thing that I guess is interesting that you could look at is if it's really a new experience, and we talked about Facebook earlier, where people don't necessarily understand that they're missing something. It doesn't happen that often. I mean, for me, I always like to focus on a problem. But if there's something that they don't understand that they're missing and they're introduced to a new experience and it's so good, then you have to figure out how to get them. This is where that get rid of the friction, give them the full benefit of that experience, and then you'll be able to start to shift adoption rates. And that's what Facebook did in that area as well. All right, here's my last question. There's still a lot to learn about growth hacking. You've been doing it a lot, but for many of our marketers here that might be watching this, let me start. There's a resource in your book. What do you teach us? What do you go through in your book really briefly? And then I want to ask you've also developed a simulation recently that people can use to try and really understand how it works. If you share those 2 for us, that'd be great.
Sure. So the book is really a lot of what I've been talking about today. So it's outlining how growth actually works. Part of it was, I mentioned it was 10 years ago last month that I coined the term growth hacking. And in that time, probably, you know, a new definition has come up for it every month since then. So part of what we wanted to do was just be able to say, okay, this is actually how companies grow, whether you want to call it growth hacking or anything else. Just this is how companies grow, and this is how you can be effective. But I learned a lot from feedback from the book of where it was falling short. So a couple places where it was falling short. One, maybe one person got excited enough about it and then they would go and try to implement it. But if the rest of the team wasn't on board, they almost always failed. So, you know, a marketer who wants to start experimenting inside product, if the product team doesn't understand why that's important and doesn't agree with them, then they're going to really suffer. So what I found was that I could work kind of on an organizational level, usually in the form of workshops, where getting everyone on the same page about how growth works, identifying what their North Star metric is, why experimentation is so important for improving growth, who does what, how the process works. And so it kind of goes beyond the book to kind of creating the culture that enables implementation of the book. The other piece is that you just can't, you can learn the theory in a book, but the practice is where you actually get good at this stuff. And so it became really hard for someone to get enough practice to have the credibility to get in and do that. And so what I've been focused on recently, I'm really excited about, as you said, the simulation is essentially the same way that a pilot, you're not going to put a pilot in a plane that, even if it's an empty plane, you don't want to kill the pilot.
I don't want to be in that plane.
Millions of dollars if they've never actually flown before. So it's actually almost 100 years ago that the first flight simulator came out, to where pilots could actually learn how to fly before they got in a plane. And then eventually they need enough hours in the plane before they can kind of fly commercially or something else. It's the same thing here, that we've actually built a simulator that replicates the entire experience of growing a venture-backed company, from coming in, determining is their product market fit, using data. So it's built on top of Amplitude Analytics. You're running queries to understand what's going on. You're coming up with surveys, you're getting input, and you're making decisions on that, and essentially navigating through all of those challenges to ultimately build a scalable business. And so the simulation actually has a kind of built-in real-time mentor in it. So even in the real world, a lot of times you make decisions, you don't have that feedback loop. So with this, the mentor is essentially saying, okay, here's what you should have done and why. But almost every single chapter or module in the book has queries that you're running in Amplitude. So you get really good at running the queries and making decisions, and you're building product skills, marketing skills, and data skills that are just kind of hard to get enough of those without actually doing it. And so that's what this simulator, it's called gopractice.io. And that's
I was just going to say, and at the end of the video, I'll go ahead and put the URL, but just one more time, where can people find that?
That's gopractice.io. And the person who I created it with is actually a former data scientist from Facebook. And so his background is more product management and data science, and mine being more marketing and eventually product-driven growth. But we're pretty good complements to kind of, and he's a super smart guy, but he finds a way to describe and explain things that makes them very understandable and accessible, some things that would otherwise be pretty complex.
Yeah, something a lot of data scientists aren't great at either. So it's right. It's kind of like, help me speak data science a little bit, will you?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for sharing those insights. Is there anything, and no is just fine, is there anything else, just kind of as we wrap up, that you would give as parting words to whether it's novice growth hackers or growth hackers that are just looking for an insight coming out of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, the key takeaways that I would highlight are: growth is impossible without product market fit. So make sure if you're a hired hand, there's founder's risk, which is finding product market fit. So that's why they get the big bucks. It's super unpredictable and risky. So if you're being tasked with growing something, I would try to come in post product market fit, pre-growth. So that's a really good sweet spot there. So, look at retention cohorts and what users say about the product. And then North Star metric, a really key concept, a metric that everyone in the company can focus on growing, that ties to customer growth, and then, or value growth of that the customers are receiving. And then just hold yourself accountable for how many experiments are we running in any given period of time to improve our learning on how we improve the trajectory of that North Star metric. And that's kind of the simplest boiled down. It's a high velocity of experimentation, the right metric, and then it starts with the right product.
Fantastic. And I think just distilling it down to those few final elements, if there's a takeaway, that's what those takeaways are. But then, of course, making it happen, that's where there's the inspiration and the perspiration, and there's a lot of perspiration and experimentation that goes on to make it work.
Absolutely.
Sean, this is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. Enjoyed it.
Great.